How to protect yourself legally when buying a business. What do billion-dollar private equity deals and a $2 million HVAC business have in common? The same legal traps, just on a different scale. M&A attorney Joseph Spina has worked with Apollo, KKR, and now dozens of searchers and independent sponsors. And he's seen it all, from stubborn sellers, bad attorneys, to blown S-corp elections that could cost buyers millions. In this episode, Joseph reveals the silent deal killers, messy I-9s, tax landmines, and hidden liabilities that show up after you've closed. He also shares the structures that protect buyers, from seller notes and escrows to transition service agreements that keep sellers engaged. If you're buying your first business or your fifth, Joseph's playbook might just save your deal and your wallet.
So there's two options that I see most of the time. There's other creative ways to do it, but one is if you're incorporating a seller note in your deal, you offset indemnifiable losses from the seller note. The other option, which is better, but sellers on smaller deals are less amenable to this. On bigger deals, it's pretty common and almost table stakes. But if you have a separate escrow, make sure that the seller's never done anything to blow the S-corp election, because that brings a lot of tax liability post-closing. It treats the entity as being deemed as being liquidated. So you have to pay basically taxes as the buyer of the full value of the purchase price if there was an inadvertent blown S election at some time during the life of the company and you inherit those liabilities in the stock sale. There's obviously ways around it and ways to mitigate that. If you do an asset sale, you obviously mitigate that. If you do an F reorganization, you obviously mitigate that. But S-corps, you always have to be careful from a tax perspective, and you want to make sure it's So started my career at a much larger law firm, O'Melveny and Myers, kind of doing the classic large cap private equity M&A thing. Working for my client for Apollo, KKR, a lot of the big dogs, but obviously the deal size was much larger. Then I was like, let me leave the law, the legal world altogether. So I actually left law firm life, went into private equity. For about 4 years, I was at Palladium Equity Partners. They had $3 billion under management, doing kind of middle market, upper middle market deals, industry agnostic. So we did things in food and bev, industrials, manufacturing, tech. It was a little bit all over the map. But about maybe 2 years and change ago, a lot of people I kind of came up with in the industry, and just kind of my friends in the space all started leaving both my PE shop, but also just places they were at, to do things a little bit more entrepreneurial, right? They wanted to kind of stop working for the man or the woman, and kind of take control of their own destiny a little bit. And all of them were like, hey, I want to buy a business, or I want to raise my own fund, or I want to become an independent sponsor. Come be my lawyer. And I was like, that sounds great, but can't go back to O'Melveny because they charge $1 million minimum in legal fees for a deal. So the math doesn't math at that point. But I also didn't really want to start my own shop, because just kind of being around M&A my whole life, or my whole career, not my whole life, you kind of need it takes a village almost, right? There's a lot of specialized knowledge you need. And, I'm an M&A attorney. I have some background in kind of the fund formation work and securities work, but I'm not a tax expert. I'm not a regulatory expert. I'm not a labor and employment expert. I need those people kind of at my disposal on my team to be able to parachute into deals as needed, right? So landed at Cullen and Dykeman, where about 200 attorneys, but priced a lot more like a boutique. We're very competitive on pricing to a lot of these 2-3 person shops. But I have, a tax expert down the hall. I have a labor and employment, partner that I work with, on all my deals. So, I kind of have those resources at my disposal, but we're able to kind of, operate and do deals kind of in this lower middle market and SMB space. I'd say my practice is half searchers doing deals under $10 million backed by SBA loans, kind of, I'm sure, which is a lot more of this contingency.
Yeah.
And then the other half are more independent sponsors, kind of either raising money from investors on a deal by deal basis or raising money into an SPV to kind of do like a roll up strategy or something like that. Deal size, let's say 10 to 50 million. But I also have some independent sponsors who have raised maybe, let's say, 20 million bucks, and then they're doing like $1-2 million deals to kind of bolt on to each other with that capital they raised. So that's kind of the 50,000-foot overview of what I do.
Okay.
But kind of
And
happy to answer.
you're in New York, right?
Yeah, we're based in New York.
And then do you do deals everywhere, all
Yeah,
50
we do
states?
deals. Yeah, we do deals everywhere. Like if there's very specialized like state law requirements, or if there's like real estate in a non kind of East Coast, Northeastern state involved in the transaction, we bring in specialized counsel. But the only real big things is if there's really, really specialized state specific rules not related to licensing, because licensing is easy. And I do a lot of home services where I kind of pretty familiar with the licensing scheme in most states. But real estate's the big one because there's a lot of very specific real estate laws that you probably need someone to kind of come in
Local.
with a little more specialized knowledge.
Okay. So, you've seen hundreds of deals. What separates a smooth transaction from a nightmare one?
Say a few things. One is the sell side, obviously. That's like the easy answer, low hanging fruit, right? But it could be two things, right? It could be the seller, but it could also be the seller's attorney. And sometimes it's like this perfect marriage of both of them, right? That kind of derails a deal. But this is what I see happen a lot. I see, especially, I do a lot of deals in the home services space, but especially in a lot of these home services deals, you have an older seller, right? Kind of ready for retirement, very stubborn, kind of done things his own way for the last 40 years, right? And he grew a successful, maybe not the cleanest business, but a successful business, right? And then he gets his local personal injury attorney to do the M&A transaction to sell his business. And, it's tough because the seller doesn't really want to get you documents. He pushes back on certain diligence items, but then also, when it comes to the purchase agreement and, the legal docs, the sell side attorney may not understand everything. So he may push back a little more, just kind of kick and scream over things that like are pretty market, but he doesn't understand them. So you have to kind of take a step back and you have to appease them a little bit, but kind of do it but explain things to them in a way that's not really patronizing them. And there's a little bit of an art to that, which it took me many reps to master.
Yeah. So if you were buying your first deal today, what would you be looking for from a legal lens?
Legal lens. So obviously, like from the financial perspective, you just need clean financials. You want clean accounting. From a legal lens, one thing I always like to look for, and this is really important on every deal, obviously it doesn't matter as much if you're doing an asset deal, but if you're doing a stock sale, which is usually the case in a lot of like home services or anything else that kind of requires a license, a lot of these are taxed as S-corps. Make sure that one, the seller's never done anything to blow the S-corp election, because that brings a lot of tax liability post-closing. It treats the entity as being deemed as being liquidated. So you have to pay basically taxes as the buyer of like the full value of the purchase price if there was an inadvertent blown S election at some time during the life of the company and you inherit those liabilities in a stock sale. There's obviously ways around it and ways to mitigate that. If you do an asset sale, you obviously mitigate that. If you do an F reorganization, you obviously mitigate that. But S corps, you always have to be careful from a tax perspective, and you want to make sure it's clean. Kind of going into the going into doing a deal, and then as far as other things I like to look for, is just like a good track record, right? Like you want to make sure that they have, if it's a contract based business with long-term commercial contracts, you want to make sure those are buttoned up. You want to make sure those are renewed post closing. And you want to make sure everything's in place seamlessly, or the contracts, if it's an asset sale, can be assigned, right? Because you don't want to buy a business and assuming you have sticky revenue and then, the deal closes and poof, right?
Yeah.
Or, there's some difficulty getting assignments, things like that.
Right.
But look, it's very deal by deal, and it's kind of like know it when you see it a little bit.
Yeah. No, I agree. So since you brought in the stock versus asset deal, so when does it make sense to do one over the other, and what traps the buyer should avoid?
Yeah, look, asset deals are obviously kind of like the preferred default approach in this space. But they're obviously, it's a little more, I don't want to say frustrating, but it could just be a little bit more of a nuisance, right? Post closing. So you have to transition everything. You got to get new payroll. You have to transition employees. You have to get new insurance. You have to get a new PEO probably. Benefits have to be transferred. It's more of a process. Obviously there's something to be said about having like the peace of mind of having just like a clean entity, right? Post closing. And usually on a deal that's a couple $1,000,000, the transition isn't that cumbersome, right?
Yeah.
However, there are times where you're buying an HVAC company, you're buying a roofing company. There are licenses that take sometimes like 8 weeks, 12 weeks to get a new license. So I do have certain clients who still prefer asset sales in those scenarios, and you either transition the licensing work through like a TSA, or you just wait to close till you get a new license, really depending on the timeline. But a lot of clients will also just prefer to do a stock sale in those instances, right? Where it's just, typically in those deals, sometimes like the seller or like a key employee will remain on, like the seller will roll or a key employee will stay on and qualify that license, because a lot of times, most folks here, even it would be myself included, if I was buying a business, I would not be able to qualify an HVAC license, right?
Correct. Correct.
I seldom pick up a hammer, right? So those are things to think about, but you could structure the deal advantageously sometimes in the stock sale with respect to seller rollover. It de-risks the transaction a little bit, right? You have the seller staying on. Obviously, like if 100% of the purchase price is, 100% of the value is like $2,000,000, and the seller rolls, 10%, right? That's 200K off the purchase price, and then the sellers also has is invested in the long-term upside of the company, right? So, sometimes stock sales could be advantageous from that perspective, but it mostly comes up when you need some sort of like business continuity. So like licensing for home services, if there's like a liquor license involved, a lot of like government contractors too, if there's like a cage code that you need to maintain. Things like that is sometimes what necessitates a stock sale. Also, like sometimes if the business is just very like operationally complex, sometimes as long as the business is generally clean from a liability standpoint, sometimes buyers just prefer to say like, hey, like I just want to step into the shoes of the seller at closing rather than having to like transition everything. Because that's what a stock sale essentially does, right? Like sometimes there's noticing requirements and things like that with respect to like having a new qualifier for your license or changing insurance coverage or, whatever it may be. But like you're really just stepping into the shoes of the seller at closing. And then it's like, like clockwork, you just kind of, obviously there's still going to be a J curve, but it's going to be a little bit smoother of a transition.
It's a lot of an easier lift than having to redo everything and transfer. Yeah.
Totally.
So let's talk about reps and warranties, which are non-negotiable for buyers from a buyer perspective.
Totally. Yeah. Not negotiable. So high level, just kind of give you like the recap of reps and warranties. In a purchase agreement, the seller will make promises, right, or representations on the conduct of the business prior to closing. Like these were our financials that we provided you. These are what we've done on taxes. These are all the employees. This is the liabilities that have been these are the liabilities we're disclosing. These are our employees, so on and so forth. The company's been organized in this state and we have only one class of stock, et cetera, et cetera. The seller is going to make representations to you so you're buying exactly what you think you're buying, right? If the seller, if something turns out not to be true post-closing, then the seller has breached one of those representations. If you incur losses related to that breach, then those losses are indemnifiable by the seller. So this kind of could like bleed into the conversation about indemnifications as well.
Yeah.
But this is why diligence is so important, right? Because you're going to do diligence. You're going to say, hey, the seller's provided all these tax returns. They've been true. There's nothing else related. There's no other tax liability outstanding besides like what's on these tax returns. Turns out, there was an audit that he didn't disclose, right? Or there was an inquiry from the IRS or the state taxing authority. Post-closing comes up and you get a follow-up on it. And now, there's this outstanding tax liability. Let's say this is a stock sale scenario because the asset sale, it won't necessarily follow. And you owe $5K in accounting expenses, $10K in legal bills, and you got hit with a $20K penalty from the IRS, right? That's $35K of indemnifiable losses. Then now you could go after the seller for, and they're liable for that under the purchase agreement. So that's typically how they work. Sometimes there's different ways to backstop that, right? Because like the default way, right, with nothing else is like you have to like kind of go after the seller directly and hope the seller like pays you 35 grand, which is like not going to often happen or it's not going to be easy to get that from them.
Yeah.
So there's two options that I see most of the time. There's other creative ways to do it, but one is if you're incorporating a seller note in your deal, you offset indemnifiable losses from the seller note. Right off the principal, if it was a whatever $1 million note and they had 100K in indemnifiable losses you incurred, now it's a 900K note, right? And you'll just re-amortize it over the life of the note. That's the easy one because you could kind of just offset it unilaterally, right? You put that language in the purchase agreement and the seller note that says like, hey, this is, all indemnifiable losses are also, offsettable from the note. The other option, which is better, but sellers on smaller deals are less amenable to this. On bigger deals, it's pretty like common and, almost table stakes. But if you have a separate escrow, right, like an indemnification escrow where it's like, hey, we're holding back 50K of the purchase price and we'll hold it in an escrow for 2 years or, 15 months or whatever it may be. But now I actually have a bucket of cash that I can dip my hand into to pay these indemnifiable losses, right? So if I have to pay 20K in IRS penalties for a tax rep being breached, I have a bucket of 20K that basically is set aside from the purchase price that I could go into. That's obviously ideal, right? Because a seller note's not really putting cash in your pocket. It's just like your debt service is being reduced.
Right.
So obviously I push for both in most of my deals. Like I would like a small escrow and then then a seller note offset after that. So I would say that's ideal, but obviously sometimes it takes some, massaging.
Yeah. So how aggressive should buyers be in the indemnity caps and survival periods, especially when sellers are not super sophisticated and get spooked?
Yeah. So let's talk LOI and then let's talk purchase agreement.
Sure. Yeah.
So LOI, mention it, but just say like the purchase agreement will be subject to customary indemnification provisions, survivals, caps, and baskets, right? And I also do the same thing with like working capital adjustment, right?
Yeah.
Unless it's a very wonky business with like, you want a separate inventory adjustment or something like that. But like usually I can just say like customary working capital adjustment, customary, indemnification, survivals, and baskets. Because you don't want to have to negotiate this at the LOI stage because it just may be too confusing for the seller. He may just pass on your offer. Just too much.
Yeah.
Especially when it's still like at a very competitive stage. Once you got them hooked and you're in exclusivity though, then you can be a little more aggressive. Yeah. So look, I would say like default survival period for indemnifications is between 1 and 2 years. 2 years is like super buyer friendly. And like in the PE space, it usually is like 6 months to a year. But it's really like I see between like 12 and 18 months in this space is like a little bit more like where you kind of end up. In PE, it's more like, or like larger cap deals, it's more like 6 to 12, because just sellers don't want to have the liability hanging out there. And also in those deals, there's a lot more reps and warranties, insurance, and things like that kind of backstop some of those liabilities as well, which you don't really get in the SME space.
Yeah.
As far as caps, what usually it is so there's a split, right? There's fundamental representations and non-fundamental representations. Usually fundamental representations is like they have authority to enter into this transaction. Their taxes and financials are accurate. Those like very foundational things. Non-fundamental is like, this is the employees list. These are our benefits. These are our leases that we're disclosing. Those are like non-fundamental. So fundamental reps are usually capped at the purchase price. Non-fundamental reps are usually capped at a much smaller percentage. Let's say larger deals, it's honestly like 2 to 3%. Smaller deals, I'll see like up to like 5 to 10. I'll try to get 10% on some of these small deals, and sellers will think it's reasonable. But really, it should be closer to like 5%. But they don't know, so you usually get it with a 10. So it's usually split. The things I'm most concerned about, like let's say it's just like a vanilla deal, there's no like crazy outstanding liabilities on things. The two things that I see the most, and then I see a question on caps. I'll answer that right after.
Yeah.
The two things that I see the most are taxes are obviously the big one, right? Because you need survival, and the survival period for fundamental caps is also going to be longer than non-fundamental, right?
Okay.
So basically what I do for survival periods is basically when the statute of limitations expires for that specific rep. And the reason I do this is because tax returns can be audited going back 3 years.
Yeah.
So if like the normal survival period is max 2 years, you don't want to have an open year of exposure for tax returns, because they can audit you. And like audit risk is like, that's a big risk. And like a lot of times these sellers are 80 years old, like who knows how accurate their tax returns are. That always is like what gives me the most anxiety. The other thing is misclassification of employees. I see a lot of these businesses try to just 1099 everybody who like shouldn't really be 1099. Obviously it's easier for their perspective, right? Like they don't have to pay payroll tax. A 1099 handles their tax issues. And it's like they don't have to give them benefits. There's just like a lot less they have to do, a lot less of a lift when everyone's just an independent contractor. But Department of Labor and the IRS also doesn't like that. It doesn't like that. So if there was like a Department of Labor or IRS audit related to your employee roster, there is exposure that like if they do determine that you've misclassified your 1099, your W-2s as 1099s, there'll be penalties, and then you also owe payroll taxes for all the open years. So like if you misclass 10 employees for 3 years, you have to pay payroll tax on those 10 employees' salary for 3 years. That could be plus any kind of penalty or fine they give you. That's a potentially large liability. So those are the two things that like I worry about the most. Let me go back to Aaron's.
Just explain the caps.
So caps is basically like just generally how caps work are the seller. Let's say there's, the seller, you have $1 million of indemnifiable losses, right? But the indemnification caps are only $500K. You wouldn't have any recourse for that incremental $500K over the first $500K because you basically agreed to a cap of $500K. Look, usually the cap amount for fundamental reps of the purchase price, one, that should be sufficient because you didn't pay anything more than the purchase price.
Purchase price, yeah.
For the non-fundamental caps, I don't really ever see it be an issue unless there's like seller fraud or something. And then you're just suing the seller for fraud, like anyway. But fraud should be carved out of indemnifications anyway. So it shouldn't be, the cap shouldn't be a real issue. but just know it's a much lower cap for like the non-fundamental stuff as it would be for the fundamental stuff.
Yeah. So what do you, what do you do when there's a key man risk or heavy customer concentration? Can the legal documents or the purchase agreement mitigate for that?
Yeah. So it's more about transaction structure, I'd say, than like kind of like what's in the docs. Like obviously there's going to be like a non-compete in the docs and things like that. But like with respect to like customer concentration and key man risk, like the best thing you could do is like try to keep the seller on or keep the seller engaged in some form or fashion, right?
Yeah.
So obviously if you're using an SBA loan, if the seller's not rolling his equity, he can only stay on for a year max. So if there's no seller rollover, you need to just be creative in a transition services agreement that lasts a year where you like hope to retain all the customers. The other way in structuring is either giving the seller rollover and keeping him, invested in the business, right? From, an economic standpoint and just upside standpoint where like he's going to want to keep those relationships going. Because usually like when there's big customer concentration and when there's large customer, it's like, it's usually the seller who's like the relationship guy, right?
Yeah.
The other option is doing something that is SBA compliant, is doing like a contingent or forgivable seller note, right? Tied to certain historical benchmarks and financial thresholds, or it could be specific customer revenue. So SBA allows a seller note to be, let's say it's $1 million seller note. You could forgive big chunks of that seller. We say tranches. You could forgive tranches of that seller note that's tied to financial performance. The way this isn't an earnout is because you have to tie it under SBA rules to like historical performance. So if you had let's say you have 3 customers, that's whatever, 80% of the revenue. And each one of those customers did $1 million a year on top line. You can say like, hey, we have $1 million seller note, but 250K of the seller note is tied to each major customer. For every dollar below $1 million, that if it hits it over $1 million, good, you pay the full amount. But if it's every dollar under $1 million, each customer like that doesn't hit, you'd reduce the seller note in that 250K tranche by $1. So it's a dollar offset between the shortfall for the amount of the delta in the the lost revenue from those big customers. That's just one example. There's a lot of ways you could structure it, but that's kind of the gist where you could make the seller note contingent tied to keeping a top line revenue number consistent from those major customers. And I'd also always say make it top line revenue, because if you try to start doing EBITDA or like numbers that are like kind of like profit, it starts getting dicey on like how that's calculated, right? Like
right. They don't have control and so forth.
Yeah, it's just and sometimes like the comparisons aren't apples to apples. Like it just starts getting dicey. So just one flag there. Yes, Aaron, you can do so. Seller rollover in it. So true seller rollover. So Aaron's question was, can you do seller rollover in an asset sale? True seller rollover is actually an asset, is actually an asset. That's how they do it in private equity, is where you buy the assets into a new co, and some of the assets are bought with cash, and then some of the assets are contributed via a contribution agreement to buyer's new co in exchange for equity in the new co. So that, let's say that the asset pool is 100% of assets. This isn't an exact science, but it works for tax purposes. Let's say you have 100% of the assets. 60% of the assets would get bought for cash by the buyer from his new co. So the assets would get transferred to new co for 60% of the EV. This 40% rollover, the seller would contribute 40% of the assets to the new co in exchange for equity in the new co. By doing it that way, the equity that's been issued in the new co to the seller is tax-free. You don't have to pay taxes on it. It's a tax-free contribution under the IRS code. So that's how seller role and asset sales are structured, and that's like true seller role. The way seller role is kind of colloquially um, referred to in like the SMB SBA world is just like a partial buyout, right? Where you're just like, I'm buying 60% of the company, the seller's retaining 40%. He's just like remaining in his place, but he's selling 60% of his shares and he's keeping 40. So that's like the other how seller role is referred to, but that's really the only way you're allowed to do seller role in the SBA world because they don't allow seller role asset sale. They did it for like 9 months and then they reverted on it. But that's the way seller rollover would work and it kind of SBA land is partial buyout.
So what stage do you like to get involved with buyers? Do you want to get it too early or a little
I
bit later, or how does it work?
Yeah, I always say as early as possible. So like, look, I'm one of the few attorneys that does not charge for LOIs, and like I'm happy to just like take a look, help you out as kind of like a relationship partnership building type exercise. And also, to be honest, it makes my life easier because like sometimes I have clients who's like, oh, he'll send me an email, the LOI will be signed. I'd be like, this doesn't work. Like now I have to go retrade this whole entire LOI. I'd rather you just send it to me.
Yeah.
We can talk about it. If there's any tweaks we need to make, we can tweak it before it's sent out. That's why that way when it's signed, we're ready to roll. So I
Okay.
say as early as possible. It's at least like if you want to cut a first draft of the LOI, then send it to me and I'll give you my thoughts. I think that's usually like a good way to approach it.
Okay. And so what's your like checklist for spotting like legal red flags in the beginning, especially from from a buyer side?
Yeah, checklist.
Yeah.
So diligence. So I do have a diligence checklist. I'm happy to kind of share it with you guys. But big things are tax structure is always like my number one, right? Especially if it's an S-corp, you got to just make sure it's clean. Um, Employee misclass risk, talked about that. Any kind of outstanding litigation of the company, right? You got to obviously major risk. Employee I-9 verification. I've definitely dealt with a lot of companies recently where like not all employees, were eligible to legally work in the United States. Obviously, with the current administration, that's like a big risk.
Yeah.
Especially in like home services where like you could lose your workforce in a day, right?
Yes.
And then like what do you do? So big risk there. And like I always even say this, like if you're in like California or Texas or even Florida, and the I-9s like look shaky, like I could look at an I-9 and be like, this looks shaky, but I'm not sure if this is real or not. There are like outside like immigration compliance folks that will do an I-9 audit, and that's something that like at least immigration lawyers do, but like my law firm doesn't really do that.
Yeah.
So sometimes I'll recommend like, hey, just spend a little extra money to get this audit done, just so you could be sure. That's a big one. Another big one that's just very, very overlooked is just real estate, right? If there's two parts to that. One, the seller owns the real estate, bake out the terms on the front end, because I've dealt with deals where like it got kicked down, the can got kicked down to closing, and then all of a sudden the seller is able to squeeze you in terms of the lease if they own it.
Yeah.
The flip side of that is if the seller doesn't own it and there's a landlord, sometimes the seller like it waits too long to give you access, and the landlord, I'm dealing with this on this trucking deal I'm doing now. The landlord absolutely squeezed us on the lease. And like we came to an agreement. It wasn't that egregious, but like it definitely held up the deal. And so like that type of stuff, it's just like it's very easily overlooked because you're like thinking about the M&A side of the deal.
Yeah.
But like you're gonna need the SBA is gonna require a 10-year term on the lease. So you're gonna need to renegotiate the lease regardless.
Yeah.
Like just you have the least likelihood of getting squeezed if you're out in front of it as early as possible.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've seen many times where the seller says, yeah, I've got it. I know this. I know the owner. I'll take care of it. And they don't. and they
Yeah, they
wait
wait
till
till the end.
last minute. Yeah.
The related to that, like this is not related to lease, but related to like squeezing you at the end is access to employees. Not you don't need access to like every employee, but access to key employees. A lot of time, and I understand the seller's perspective on this. So this is like it's you need to be sensitive and flexible, but a lot of times the seller doesn't want to give you access to any of his employees till the deal closes. But you need, like, if there's a GM in the business, like you need access to the GM. You need to talk to the
Yes.
GM before close. You need to understand, like, one, they're committed to the next stage with you. And two, you need like a little bit of operational flavor of the business that, like, so you can better understand like what you're getting yourself into. Um, and that's tricky. And that's something I do recommend actually putting in the LOI. Like something general, like seller will, provide access to like X individual, at least 2 weeks prior to closing or, whatever it is. And like if you miss it in the LOI, then like sometimes if we do a non-simultaneous sign and close, it'll be a closing condition.
Oh, okay. So you make it closing. Okay,
Yeah,
got it.
so like, and a lot of times these SBA deals, like these are most of the time. I mean, it's not all the times, but most of the time it's a non-simultaneous sign and close. Usually the period between sign and close isn't too long. It's like a week or so. But a
Yeah.
lot of times the bank, the SBA lender wants to see like final documents, and they need a 5-day review period before they can close the loan. So a lot of times, like you're signing a week prior to closing anyway, so you do have a little bit of that time gap.
Yeah.
But if there are key employees you want to meet, it wasn't kind of like negotiated in the LOI. Like maybe you do it two weeks in between sign and close, and you sign, get access, within that 2 weeks, and then you close.
Yeah, because there's a big, and I've seen this, especially in home services, where the key employee thinks that he's going to inherit the business or he's going to have first right of refusal or something, and then it creates a big mess at the end if there's no communication.
I dealt with this in a big commercial printing business. It was actually the owner's daughter, which was like it was a little spicy at the end. But
Oh, so what
so
happened? Tell us the story. What
yeah, yeah, I.
happened?
So this is in Miami actually.
Okay.
Um, and we bought a commercial printing business, like $3 million purchase price. Um, Seller also squeezed us on the lease on this one too, because she owned the real estate. But that's besides the point. Seller's daughter was the GM of the business. She always thought that she was gonna be inherited the business, and we kind of knew that from the broker at the outset. The mom wasn't, I guess, totally honest with the daughter about like how she knew she was shopping the business. It wasn't like that much of a blind side, but I think she didn't entirely, be transparent about like where she was in the process and how imminent it was, et cetera, et cetera. So we were like, we need to get access to, her name was Jessica. We need to get access to Jessica. We need to get access to Jessica because like she's the only person kind of like in the business that's staying that like kind of knows how to run the show. And also the lender was First Internet on this deal. First Internet essentially was like, they were like, all right, we need access to Jessica. We need to make sure she's staying on.
Oh, the bank
Then,
wanted
but,
to.
but then it turned into, we need to make sure she's staying on and you need to give her equity.
Wow.
Because they wanted to protect their investment and make
The
sure someone who knew
retention.
how to run the business was running.
Yeah.
So it wound up kind of solving the first problem where like she felt slighted that her mom was selling the business and not to her because she wound up getting it was phantom equity, but she wound up getting some phantom equity in Newco, which she felt a little more comfortable about because she was participating in some of the upside.
Got it.
So if you're dealing with a key employee that feels slighted, a good way to bridge the gap without giving them like voting control or operational control is thinking about doing some sort of phantom equity structure where they just get like a profits interest in the business, but they don't have any like governance rights.
And how much profit share was the
5%. So it
5%?
wasn't super large, but like,
Okay.
She's getting it for free, so.
Okay. And she felt good about it.
She felt good about it because she didn't have the money to buy the business either. So she had to be
Sure.
steeped in reality in some respect.
And that's why it takes it. So when which how far in the process did that conversation did that happen?
Probably too late,
Okay.
but probably too late. But it was like maybe it was still probably a month before closing.
Okay.
We had
Got it.
enough time to just like put together a grant agreement. We did like a little like phantom equity plan that she signed up to
Who
uh,
ended up paying for it? Did the mom end up
for the
contributing to that? Yeah.
for the 5%.
Yeah.
No,
No, she didn't. Okay.
no, it
So the
was it
buyer.
was it was yeah it was just 5% pro. I guess the one thing about the phantom equity is you only get paid out of profits interest over a hurdle. So your hurdle is whatever you bought the business at. So she's really like not starting from zero. She's only really um participating in the appreciation. Right?
Oh,
Because
so the upside.
let's say you bought the business for 3 and you sold it at 10. She's only participating in the 7 million. She's not
Got it.
participating in all 10. So
Got it.
like, yes, you are giving up some of your upside if you're the buyer, but you're not really paying for it on the front end because it's not part of your purchase price,
Makes sense.
right?
Okay. Yeah, it makes sense. So what's some of the best legal steps for the seller, for that seller transition periods, especially when they want to stay or they want to, but avoid the accountability. They don't want to, be accountable.
Yeah, I mean, the easy answer here is just do a transition services agreement. That really, really, one, they're essentially like a 1099 during the transition period. Let's say it's 3 months, let's say it's 6 months, but then you really, really outline the steps of like everything they need to do. Hey, is there a license involved? You have to help us notify the licensing board to change like the qualifier of the license. Hey, you need to train me 6 hours a week for the first 3 weeks. Then you can do it 2 hours a week. Then you could be remote an hour a week for, the last 3 months, whatever it is. Um, but it's best to set a schedule because if you don't, and it's not contractually agreed to, the seller's
Yeah.
going to be on an island somewhere, and you're never going to be
Yeah.
able to get on. You're never going to be able to get a hold of them, right? So you're going to want to really kind of like lock in a commitment.
Yeah.
And on this trucking deal, we have the seller rolled some equity. He rolled 10%, but he's kind of like the seller's kind of like this young, flashy dude who just wound up being really successful in trucking. Guys like in Dubai every other week. Like we just lose contact to him on this transaction. Like every other week, he's like, I'm actually very friendly with the seller's attorney because I've done a few deals with them. Um, and there's like, yeah, we can't get in touch with Bobby this week. So we put together a transition services period,
That's
and I
funny.
was like, we need to have a very, very strict schedule for Bobby because like this guy's impossible to pin down. So I know he's just going to disappear. He's going to vanish off the face of the earth after closing.
Yeah.
Because he wants his role to be like pretty passive, like his seller rollover to be pretty passive. Um, so what I did is we have basically this is how we have to negotiate it. He has like an hours requirement every week. It's for 3 months. If he wants to go away for a week, he's allowed to, but he has to make up for it on the back end, the training period. Like the
Nice.
transition period gets extended. So I'm like, Bob, you could go on your vacations because I know you're about to spend this $6 million you're getting on a bunch of extravagant trips. But we need you for like at least 3 months in the aggregate to like train my guys up.
That makes sense. And so you call that a transition agreement or
Transition
transition
services.
service
TSA.
agreement, and it's a separate page that you add.
Separate doc, and like basically it'll be a closing deliverable in the purchase agreement. It'll be like, you know, your purchase agreement will be say like, oh, besides the purchase agreement, there's XYZ closing deliverables. Usually
Yeah.
it's like a seller note, like a bill of sale and an asset sale. You need that for tax purposes.
Yeah.
An asset allocation schedule, how you're going to allocate the purchase price for tax purposes. Um, and then a TSA is also a pretty popular one, especially like especially if it's very specialized and you need the seller to, you want the seller to kind of like agree and commit to a specific training schedule post closing,
Yeah.
you have one. The other way a transition services agreement is used is if there are two ways. If there are certain contracts that can't be necessarily assigned at closing or transitioned, sometimes like the way or if there's just like a ton of contracts, it's like impossible to assign them all before closing. Basically, you make a transition services agreement with actually no finite end date. The finite end date is tied to when the last contract in that kind of bucket of contracts is completed. So if it's an asset sale, you could contribute, you could continue to like perform under old co, or the seller could, to help kind of get those contracts finalized. And then when you enter into the new contracts with those counterparties, it'll be with new co. That's done a lot in the private equity context, because you're dealing with like very large businesses with like thousands of contracts. It's just like not feasible to like assign all of them before the, or get consent to assignment before the closing date.
Yeah.
That's one way to do it. And the other thing is, I mentioned this before, in like home services with licensing. If you want it, I have an independent sponsor client who buys roofing businesses, and he prefers an asset sale just kind of for tax and liability purposes, right? The way we do it is every deal we do an asset sale, but we don't have the new license right at closing. We have a TSA with Old Co where they continue to perform the work under the old license and just assign us the AR from that work post-closing. And we do that till we get the license. And then there's also every single one of those deals has significant seller rollover. So we know the seller's not going to disappear because we actually rolled them into the new co. But Old Co, since it's an asset sale, still exists, right? It still exists and still has its own license. So we wait to actually transition all the employees over till that like transition period is done. So that's like
that can be kind of messy, because because you're getting more, so you don't take any new sales, you force them not to take any new sales on the old co once they
correct.
have. Okay.
We transition it over all at one point, flagging that this cannot be done under SBA because your lender will never allow you to do it.
Correct.
This is an independent sponsor. He raised money from investors and he funds totally with equity. So you can be a little bit more cowboyish.
Yeah.
It's actually worked out pretty successfully, because basically we tee everything up, we get ready to go. And then like as soon as we get the license, everything gets transitioned over in one day.
Okay.
So
that makes sense. That's
there
fascinating.
may be like, in reality, there may be like a few jobs that like they're not totally compliant, but
yeah. That makes sense. So any advice on let's talk about working capital, because that's a big one. How do you think about working capital? How do you kind of like manage that whole conversation? Because it's always like a pain if you're in deals.
Yeah. So working capital, current assets minus current liabilities. In the M&A context, it usually excludes cash, right? So it's really just AR and inventory minus AP and like certain other payables.
Yeah. Work in progress.
Yeah. So you need to have a conversation with your accountant or whoever's doing your QAV at the front end to see like how much working capital, is it 1 month, is it 3 months, is it 12 months that you need in the business to be successful? Like, is it like a capital intensive business where you like need 5 months of working capital, or is it pretty like low, like, there's low working capital requirements where a month would be sufficient? So first you have to figure out what the time frame is, because every business is different. I'd say like 3 months is like normal, but like it's so all over the place. It's hard.
Well, it's all B2B, B2C. Usually in the B2C, it's a short. It's like, a 2 months maybe. And then B2B, are you talking about subcontracting to a large contractor, then they can drag you for 6 months, or government, or, but B2B tends to be longer.
Yeah, totally. So that's an important conversation to have with your accountant, like on the front. Like in like QAV financial diligence, they'll start to like understand like what those requirements are, and that needs to be kind of hashed down the outset. So once you find out that number, right, you find out like actually digging into their financials, what the working capital peg is based on 4 months of AR plus inventory minus AP and work in progress or other payables. That number is going to be used as your peg, and then what that peg is going to be measured against what the actual working capital is at closing, right? And then the purchase price will be adjusted downward if it's less, dollar downward if it's less, or it could be adjusted upward, which is I've never seen before ever in my entire life, but could be adjusted upwards in theory if it's more. So that's how working capital adjustments work. Now, thinking about like how to think about it and how to have that conversation, that's a much trickier topic. The best way to approach it is like, first, you hope the seller has a good attorney, because then you could kind of like route it through the attorneys. But I have deals where it's routed through the attorneys and the seller just still doesn't understand it. Like, just, wait, I have to leave AR with the business? Yeah, that's part, you know what I mean? So it's not an exact science. It's hard to give you a perfect answer for this, but it's definitely don't go too deep in the LOI, because they're gonna be like, what the fuck is this? But it needs to be a conversation early-ish on, where like at least in the first draft, your purchase agreement that you share with them, you could at least establish a peg, and you guys can agree this is how much working capital needs to be in the business. Now, if you need to kind of start massaging like how work in progress is treated, how inventory is valued, you can do that, but at least you establish this baseline of like, this is how much money or this is how much working capital needs to be left with the business so I can operate normally post-closing.
Yeah.
And I have some clients who also negotiate like that operating cash as part of working capital, right? Like sometimes they need it, especially in like you said, if there's a lot of subs in the business or things like that, you need the cash.
Yeah. It depends on the seller and how, good of a seller they are, and then based on the relationship that you build with the seller. So the more upfront, deep relationship you have, the more time you spend with the seller, the more they like you and trust you, the better the deal looks and the terms look. I want to see if anyone has any questions. Jeremy, Philip, because I can go for hours on this. You can jump in at any time. So in terms of seller financing, what are some of the things that how do seller financing terms go sideways?
It's another good one. A few ways. I mean, this is what I see the most in deals. And I wouldn't say necessarily makes the deal go sideways, but there's a disconnect on this in literally every single deal. Every deal. It's the same thing. It's that the seller thinks you're personally guaranteeing his note and you do not.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You don't put it in the LOI and they just send you a seller note and security agreement and a guarantee. It's every single deal I ever do. It's the same thing. So I just expect it at this point. So that's one where you have to either just say, like, you either put like in the LOI, this will not be personally guaranteed, and then you could at least point back to the LOI, or you just either come to a reasonable kind of like middle ground, which is either like a partial guarantee. Obviously, a personal guarantee would have to be subordinated to SBA debt regardless, right?
Yeah.
Or what I like to try to employ is kind of like a corporate guarantee, where you're basically like pledging back the assets of the business on like a subordinated basis back to the seller. A lot of sellers don't like this, and I mean, I wouldn't either if I was a seller, because it's just like a business give back essentially. Like, hey, I ran your business into the ground, can't pay the seller note, here's the assets back. So obviously, like, it's not ideal for them.
Yeah.
Sometimes they just want to feel like they're getting a win and they just accept it. Like on a few deals now, I got them to agree to it. But that's really meaningless. That's basically like an unsecured note. So like if they offer that as a middle ground, absolutely take it. But the other middle ground that I see a lot is like some sort of partial guarantee, like maybe like half the note is PG, but it's still subordinated to the SBA debt. That's a big one. The other big flag is, I mentioned this before, but the indemnification offset, right? Where you're going to use the note as a source of recovery for your indemnification provisions. Sometimes sellers just like flip out when they see this, because they're like, what? Like, you're not going to pay my note. You're going to like nickel and dime me.
Yeah.
A good way to like get around that is going back to like caps and baskets on indemnifications is a lot of times sellers will, well, this is one of agreed to in most deals, but there's like a tipping basket. So basically, like, so you can't like nickel and dime indemnifications where it's like, hey, yes, the seller's liable for everything, but nothing's going to be recoverable until there's like 20K of losses that I've incurred. And then once it goes over the 20K, the basket tips back and you're able to recover from the first dollar. But like it avoids like the nickel and diming issue. We're like, hey, I incurred $11 of losses for, you know what I mean? Like it's,
Yes.
It's an administrative thing almost, but it's also, I think, if you have a feature like that, it may be helpful to the seller where you could even point to it or be like, hey, I'm not going to like nickel and dime you on this note. If it's something big, it has to be offset. Otherwise, like, I have every intention of paying, right?
Makes sense. Yeah. So final question, what's the one deal that taught you the most? What went wrong? What went right? What's that one?
Yeah. There was two.
Okay, that's great. Even better.
But this is like both what went wrong.
Okay.
One is it was a publishing deal. And we were buying actually a very iconic American brand, like a media brand. They had a publishing division. And this wasn't really it was more my client's fault, to be honest, but it was my fault for not pushing him. So we agreed on evaluation of the LOI. My client thought there would be he was raising money for this deal. He thought there'd be no issue raising the money. I think the purchase price was $13 million. He like waited till legal docs were done before he like picked up the phone to even reach out to like one investor. And like, if you guys are ever raising money, even on an SBA deal, like raising like maybe amounts for just the equity injection, this needs to be like, once the LOI is signed, it's all systems go with legal docs, legal diligence, investor fundraising, SBA loan. Like it's all systems go with all four silos, not just, hey, I'll raise money when I get to it. Raising money takes the most time and it's the hardest. There was a little bit of it took him, we were like 4 months in and the business was kind of bleeding a little bit, like performance wise. So now a company that was like 2.3 mil of EBITDA now was like 1.7. And then the next month it was like 1.3. It was just like the annualized run rate was getting like much, much lower. So now like you can't raise on it. And private equity was selling. It was like a carve out from private equity. So they were like, we're not reducing the purchase price. Like, go after yourself. And like private equity doesn't accept like seller notes. They want cash at close. There's no like structure in a private equity transaction, just cash at close. So deal died. We couldn't get to an agreement, but it was just waiting way too long to try to raise money. And that deal died there. So that's cautionary tale. Like if you need to raise money, that should be done ASAP along with the other kind of silos. The other one, this is why I'm so crazy about I-9s now, is we did a roofing deal in California, a pretty large one, and they had all the I-9s. They looked fine. They were like, they looked like real I-9s. Turns out after closing, the seller makes a comment to my client, hey, X, Y, and Z like aren't like legal. And they were like pretty key employees. So like there's like a little like hint of seller fraud here, but my client like didn't want to give back the company, especially because it was a really good company, really cash flowing, and nothing happened, right? Like nothing happened yet. So like indemnifications weren't triggered. You could kind of sue him for seller fraud and like try to unwind the transaction, but he didn't want to do that. But now like he's worried about like a raid and him losing his 3 key employees. So we found a way to structure around it because there was actually, to not get too far into the weeds, there was a key employee who this seller meant to give equity to like 5 years prior, but never did. So basically, he gave us a 40% discount on the purchase price to give him a profits interest, to give the GM a profits interest worth that like $6 million post closing, which we did. But we tied it to EBITDA. So like if performance falls off a cliff, that $6 million turns to zero. So
Yeah.
like that's how we kind of backstop that risk. But the tail is if there's a lot of even if they don't look sketchy,
Yeah.
there's a lot. If you live in California, Texas, Florida, and there's a lot of like just questionable I-9, there could be
Yeah.
any kind of hint of that. Just get an I-9 audit done. Plus like
Yes.
a few grand. It's just like worth the backstop.
You know, it's funny. I actually heard 3 stories like that just this year
Because
with
people
like,
falsify them too. And like, if you're not like an
yes.
I-9 expert, like how are
Yeah.
you really supposed to know? It's like assigned to I-9, there's a number on it. Like,
Yeah. Yeah. And with the key person, not
yeah,
necessarily like employees. Joseph, this was really good. Thank you very much. I appreciate
no problem.
you coming. I'm gonna shoot you an email. I'll add your contact information to the group.
Great.
And we'd love to bring you back. I think we just scratched the surface.
Yeah, of course. No, this was fun. Thanks for having me.
I appreciate it.
Hopefully
Thank
talk
you.
to you guys, everyone soon.
Thank you. Have a good
Yeah.
one. Bye.